A motel cleaner helped a sick guest at 3 a.m. Unaware he was a millionaire running from a forced wedding. This is not your job. Julie. You are not paid to knock on doors at this hour. Julie stood at the counter in the dimly lit front office of the motel. The rain pattering softly on the windows behind her. Her hair was damp from checking the perimeter. Dark curls clinging to her neck. She looked at Mr. Curtis, the aging manager, whose eyes hadn't left the tiny television flickering on a high shelf. I heard something break, she insisted quietly. Glass. Maybe. From room 6. Curtis waved her off with a sigh. His focus still locked on the late-night talk show. So. That room paid in cash. Guest came in late. Alone. Probably dropped a glass or a bottle. It's none of our concern. Julie's voice remained calm but firm. If someone's sick. Or in trouble. They pay to be left alone. Not to be babysat. He grumbled. This place survives on minding our own business. Julie hesitated for a moment. Her conscience warring with his indifference. Then. Without another word. She turned and walked to the key rack behind the desk. She took the spare for room 6 and stepped out into the rain-soaked night. The motel sat on the edge of an old logging road in rural Oregon. Tucked between tall pines and the ever-present smell of damp earth. It had once been a lively stop for road trippers and nature lovers. But those days were long gone. Now. It was mostly silence. The occasional long-haul trucker. And the steady whisper of rain against the aging roof. Julie moved quickly along the covered walkway. Her sneakers splashing in puddles. A single. Flickering bulb buzzed above the door to room 6. She paused outside. Listening. No voices. No music. Just the echo of something broken and the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt wrong. She knocked gently. Sir. Hello. I work here. I just want to make sure everything's okay. No answer. She knocked again. Louder this time. I'm coming in. Just to check on you. The key slid into the lock smoothly. She pushed the door open. The room was dark. Lit only by the faint blue glow of a television screen on mute. The air was heavy with the scent of damp fabric and something sharp. Like sweat and metal. A table lamp lay shattered on the floor. Its shade bent at an odd angle. The bed sheets were a tangled mess. Kicked to the side. A duffel bag was overturned near the armchair. Its contents a few simple clothes spilled out across the worn carpet. And near the foot of the bed. A man lay collapsed on the floor. Julie's heart pounded as she stepped inside quickly. He was young. Maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. Dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. His shirt sticking to his chest. His lips were pale. His skin flushed and dangerously damp. She dropped to her knees beside him. Her hand instinctively going to his forehead. It was burning hot. Sir. She said softly. Can you hear me? His head rolled slightly. A pained groan catching in his throat. But his eyes remained closed. Julie's gaze swept the room for clues. The duffel bag held little, a change of clothes. A phone with a shattered screen. A crushed water bottle. On the nightstand. She spotted a boarding pass. Ripped cleanly down the center. The destination read, Newark to Portland. The name had been smeared by water, rendered unreadable. She stepped into the bathroom and flipped on the light. A heavy silver wedding band sat in the bottom of the sink, looking as if it had been tossed there with disgust. A wallet lay beside it, open but empty. No ID. No credit cards. Nothing. She returned to the man's side and gently shook his shoulder. You need help. I can call an ambulance. But he groaned, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. No hospital. He sounded like someone who hadn't spoken aloud in days. She found herself nodding in agreement, a strange sense of understanding passing over her. She began to help him move onto the bed. Julie steadied his weight as best she could, her arms shaking slightly as she pulled him up from the floor. He was heavier than he looked, his body slack with fever. Each breath he took rattled in his chest. A rough, wet sound of infection clawing its way through his lungs. She had heard it before, in sterile hospital rooms during her sister's final days. It was the sound of a body too exhausted to fight. She eased him onto the bed, adjusting the flat pillow beneath his head. His face was pale and glistening with sweat. He stirred but did not speak. His lips cracked, his skin burning to the touch. His shirt clung to his chest, damp and wrinkled, and his hands twitched now and then in a restless fever. Julie worked quickly. She turned off the flickering television and brought the small electric kettle from the lobby into the room. In 15 minutes, she had warmed up a can of soup on the portable burner she kept for emergencies and dampened a cloth to cool his forehead. The motel's first aid kit was laughably stocked, mostly Band-Aids and outdated aspirin, but she found something mild for the fever. She spooned a bit of the warm broth into a mug and touched it to his lips. He swallowed slowly, barely conscious. Just a little. She murmured. You need it. She didn't ask for a name, didn't press him for answers. Whatever had driven him here, the ripped boarding pass, the discarded ring, the empty wallet, was a story she didn't need to understand right now. All that mattered was that he was sick, and someone had to help. After covering him with a blanket and wiping his forehead one last time, she left a short note on the bedside table, written on a napkin. You don't have to talk. Just rest. You're not alone. She closed the door gently behind her. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale gray and the clean scent of wet pine. Julie brought clean towels and a thermos of ginger tea to room 6. She knocked once and waited. A hoarse voice answered faintly. Come in. She opened the door to find him sitting up in bed, his legs covered by the blanket. He looked better, still pale, but his eyes were open. They were a clear gray blue that watched her with a mix of caution and exhaustion. You're the one who, he started, his voice rough. Julie gave a small smile. Brought soup? Yes. He cleared his throat. Thank you. She set the thermos down on the table. You were burning up. Still are. But not as bad. You need fluids, rest, and probably antibiotics. But I figured I'd let you keep your secrets. He looked away, a flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. You passed out, she said simply. That's not drama. That's your body saying it's had enough. He hesitated. My name is Evan. She tilted her head. Is that the real name? Or the one you want me to use? He gave a weak chuckle. The sound surprising them both. It's real. For what it's worth. Julie didn't press further. She opened the curtains a bit, letting in some of the soft, filtered light. The trees outside swayed gently in the breeze. The forest dense and quiet around them. I should go, Evan said, shifting on the bed. Julie turned to him. Her eyebrows lifted. You can barely sit up. I'll find a way. She folded the extra blanket at the foot of the bed and met his gaze. No one walks out of this forest with a fever and lungs full of rain. He blinked, surprised by her calm certainty. You're not being held hostage, she said, her voice soft. But you're not walking anywhere today. He sagged back against the headboard, the fight draining out of him. Fine, he muttered. One more day. Julie gave a single, decisive nod. Good. She stepped out into the hallway, closing the door gently behind her. Inside, Evan leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The small, crumpled napkin still folded in his hand. The rain returned on the second morning, soft and steady, whispering against the motel windows like it had never left. Julie woke early and brewed ginger tea in the staff kitchenette. She added a dollop of honey, wrapped a warm muffin in a napkin, and placed both gently outside the door to room 6. No knock. No sound, just quiet offerings left like seeds planted in silence. Evan had not asked for anything. Julie had not asked for answers. That was the unspoken rhythm of those days. He stayed in room 6, wrapped in borrowed blankets, the television off, the blinds half open to the trees. She passed through the hallway like a breeze, leaving soup, folded towels, and warmth in her wake. On the third day, Julie collected a small bundle of his clothes from outside his door. 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, socks that had seen better days. She washed them in the back laundry room, the scent of soap filling the small space. She hung them to dry and pressed them as best she could with the old iron. Her fingers were gentle as she folded each item, smoothing the fabric with a care she hadn't realized she possessed. Into the pocket of the fresh shirt, she tucked a note on a piece of her own handmade craft paper, written in her looping, quiet hand, if there ever comes a day you feel like talking, I'll listen. And if not, I'm still here. That evening, she placed the clean clothes outside his door along with a bowl of stew and a small piece of cornbread. She didn't wait to see if he opened it. Inside, Evan sat on the edge of the bed. The fever was mostly gone, though his body still ached and his chest still pulled tight with every breath. The fog in his mind, however, had begun to lift. He'd slept more in these last 3 days than he had in the past 3 months. He picked up the folded shirt and read the note slowly. Something in his chest tugged. A feeling he couldn't name. The silence wasn't heavy here. It didn't demand anything of him. Julie moved like the forest itself, quiet, patient, always present. She did not need to know who he was or where he had come from. Somehow, that made him want to stay. On the nightstand, the wedding ring still sat in a small dish. For 2 days, he had ignored it, pretended it was not there. But now he found himself staring at it. He reached for it. The metal was cool against his fingers. Its weight far heavier than it had ever been before. It had once symbolized duty. A transaction dressed up in flowers and tuxedos. A merger. Not a marriage. He had worn it out of fear of disappointing his family. Of breaking a legacy. Of being the selfish one. But it had never, ever been about love. He turned the ring over in his palm. Then, slowly, he reached into his duffel and pulled out a handkerchief. He wrapped the ring carefully inside. Folded the cloth into a neat square. And set it on the corner of the nightstand. Not thrown. Not buried. Just put down with intention. A quiet acceptance. He looked out the window. Watching the mist creep through the trees. And thought about how long it had been since he had done anything without a reason. Without permission. For the first time in years. He did not feel owned by anyone. Back in the office. Julie watched the rain and sipped her own tea. She didn't expect thanks. Didn't need closure. There was something healing about just helping. Expecting nothing in return. She had once sat in hospital rooms for weeks at a time. Holding her sister's hand without knowing what to say. And she had learned then, sometimes. Just being there was the most powerful thing a person could do. 3 days. No questions. No name spoken beyond what he had offered. But that evening, when Julie came by with a small lantern for his room in case the lights flickered again, she found something unexpected outside his door. The bowl. Washed and placed carefully in a paper bag. And a note folded on top. In clean, deliberate handwriting were 5 words, "Thank you for the silence." By the 4th day, the fever had broken completely. Evan's breathing was steadier. Less ragged. The weight in his chest remained. But it was no longer entirely physical. The rain had eased into a gentle mist. And the pine forest surrounding the motel breathed with the quiet patience of the northwest wilderness. Julie knocked gently that morning. Holding a folded sweater in one hand and a fresh thermos of tea in the other. Evan opened the door slowly. But standing upright. He looked tired. But no longer like a man drowning in his own body. "It'll be chilly in the woods," Julie said. Holding out the sweater. "It's not pretty. But it's warm." Evan took the soft, forest green knit and nodded. "Thank you." He pulled it on carefully. It hung a little loose. And he rolled the sleeves at the cuffs. "Yours?" Julie shrugged. "Used to be my dad's. Now it mostly lives in a drawer." Evan looked past her toward the trees. "I could use some fresh air." They walked in silence down the narrow trail behind the motel. Where the woods stretched in every direction. Moss hanging from the branches like green lace. The earth was soft and damp beneath their feet. And the air smelled of wet leaves. Cedar. And pine sap. Birdsong fluttered through the trees. Distant and delicate. Neither of them spoke for a long while. There was no need. At a small clearing where the sun broke weakly through the clouds. Evan paused. Taking in the quiet. "This place. It's different," he said. Julie glanced at him. "You mean peaceful?" He nodded. Like the world stops humming for a bit. They continued walking. Their footsteps muffled on the damp earth. Eventually, they reached a shallow stream where stones jutted above the surface like a natural bridge. Water gurgled softly. flowing downhill with no destination but down. Evan stood watching it for a moment. Then said, his voice low, "I was supposed to get married next week." Julie didn't react. She crouched beside the stream, running her fingers through the cold water. "Not because I wanted to," he continued. "It was an arrangement. My family. Hers. 2 companies. A merger disguised as vows." Julie looked up at him. "And you?" "I didn't say no for a long time. It felt easier to let it happen than to cause a storm." Julie's fingers stilled in the water. "But storms come anyway." He met her eyes. "Yes. They do." There was a long pause. Not uncomfortable. Just full of unsaid things. Julie stood and brushed her hands on her jeans. "So. What now? You run forever?" Evan gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "I don't know. Maybe I stop running. Maybe I just walk." Julie tilted her head. "Learning to choose what brings peace instead of what brings approval." He nodded slowly, as if those words unlocked something he hadn't yet been able to name. They turned to head back, taking a different trail as the trees closed in gently around them. The mist began to thicken, and the moss-covered path grew slippery in places. Julie moved ahead, stepping from rock to rock across a narrow stream bend. But her foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. She stumbled sideways, her arms flailing to catch her balance. In one swift, reflexive motion, Evan lunged forward and caught her around the waist, pulling her back upright before she could fall. They stood still for a moment, her body pressed against his. The breath knocked slightly out of her chest. She clung to his arm instinctively, her heart racing. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice smaller than she expected. Evan didn't let go right away. His hand lingered just long enough to make the moment stretch, fragile and clear. Their eyes met his stormy and searching, hers wide and steady. In the soft hush of the forest, the space between them seemed to hold something new and unspoken. It was not romance in the traditional sense. There was no grand music, no dramatic declaration. It was recognition. 2 people, each quietly undone by their past, standing steady in a place where words mattered less than presence. Julie slowly stepped back, brushing a stray leaf from her jacket. "I'm fine," she said, her voice light but a little unsteady. Evan didn't answer. He just nodded. And they continued walking side by side, the sound of water and wind filling the silence. By the time they returned to the motel, the sky had darkened slightly and the lights in the lobby flickered on. The distance between them had changed, subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. And in that new space, something had begun to grow. Not loudly, not urgently, but deeply. The rain had stopped completely the next morning, leaving glittering beads of dew on the pine needles and the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. The world felt as if it were holding its breath. Evan sat at the small desk in room 6. The overhead light dim but steady. In front of him lay a sheet of the rough-textured, handmade paper he had found in his laundry, slightly uneven at the edges, speckled with tiny flecks of dried lavender and pine fiber. Next to it sat a small bottle of brown ink and a pen Julie had once left in the laundry room. The ink smelled faintly of cedar. The pen scratched softly across the paper as he wrote. The words didn't come easily. He wasn't used to saying thank you. Not like this. Julie. You didn't ask where I came from or why I looked like someone who didn't belong. You didn't ask for anything. You just let me be. Quietly. Completely. And in that, you gave me more peace than I've ever known. This place. And you. Helped me see myself not as who I was supposed to be, but who I might become. Thank you for the silence. For the soup. And for your stillness. They healed me more than you know. Evan Hay. He folded the letter carefully and set it beneath the small mug she always left outside his door. Then, from his duffel, he pulled out the handkerchief he had wrapped the ring in. The ring was gone now. Left behind somewhere between memory and mercy. But the cloth remained. He zipped his bag and looked around the room one last time. Room 6 had become a kind of pause button on his life. He stepped outside into the pre-dawn dark. The gravel crunching softly under his boots. No goodbye. No final knock. The trees swayed gently as he disappeared down the road. At dawn, Julie awoke early. The sun was barely visible behind a curtain of low, gray clouds. She tied her hair up, brewed coffee in the office, and stepped out to begin her rounds. She knocked once on the door of room 6, balancing a tray with a fresh towel and a muffin. There was no answer. She waited. Then knocked again. Still nothing. With a growing sense of finality, Julie unlocked the door with the master key. The room was quiet, clean, and untouched. The bed was neatly made. The window slightly ajar to let in the forest air. And on the table, next to an untouched cup of tea, sat a single sheet of her handmade paper. Her eyes landed on the note. She walked in slowly and picked it up, reading it word by word, her thumb resting against the edge where the ink bled faintly. When she finished, she stood in the center of the room for a long time. Then, softly, as if speaking not to the empty space but to someone just beyond it, she said, "I hope you find a place where you don't have to run." Her voice did not tremble. There were no tears. No aching heartbreak. Just the soft kind of sorrow that follows when unexpected goodness leaves your life. She opened the window wider, letting the scent of the forest roll in. Behind her, room 6 held no trace of chaos, no boarding pass. No fevered moans. No wedding ring in the sink. Only a note and the echo of quiet footsteps that had passed through her world like a breeze in the trees, gentle, brief, and unforgettable. 3 weeks had passed. The motel had settled back into its slow rhythm. Julie was folding towels behind the front desk when the bell above the door chimed. "Morning, Julie," came a familiar voice. Mr. Harland, a retired park ranger, stepped inside, dropping his duffel with a soft grunt. "You seen the news yet?" he asked, pulling a folded newspaper from under his arm. Some billionaire vanished on his wedding day. No warning. Big scandal. Julie glanced up. "No. Haven't read anything today." "Here." He flattened the paper on the counter, tapping the headline, "Evan Whitaker disappears hours before billion-dollar wedding." A glossy photo showed a man in a tuxedo. Sharp features. A blank expression. Polished to perfection. Julie's hand froze mid-fold. Harlan chuckled. Unaware. Fiancée is the daughter of some shipping tycoon. Big merger. Big press. Guy just walks away. Some say he snapped. Others think he's hiding in Europe. He paused. Julie. You okay? She nodded slowly. Yeah. Just a long shift. When he was gone, Julie took the newspaper into the small office. She laid it open. Reading the details, lavish ceremony. 500 guests. A mountain of expectations. The article spoke of legacies and empires. Of disappointment and silence. No one knew why he had left. Julie closed the paper gently. She hadn't needed to know the world he had walked away from. She had only needed to know who he was when that world fell away. She slipped a hand into her pocket. Her fingers closing around a small square of fabric she'd kept, a simple handkerchief with a tiny embroidered leaf. That evening, she refreshed the vase on the front counter. This time she chose white heather and fern, symbols of solitude and protection. She lit a small candle by the window and sat quietly, breathing in the scent of lavender and pine from a sachet nearby. And in the fading light, Julie whispered to the empty forest. I hope you're somewhere the sky feels wide. Not with regret. Not with longing. Just with hope. It was a quiet night in early spring. Nearly a month since Evan had vanished from the edge of the Oregon woods. The sky outside the motel was a deep, inky blue, painted with the final strokes of dusk. The rain had stopped, but mist still curled through the trees like breath on glass. Julie was behind the front desk, sorting keys, when the soft chime of the door echoed through the room. A figure stood just inside, framed by the lamplight. Tall, shoulders square, dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans. His hair was damp from the mist. But his eyes, those gray-blue eyes, were unmistakable. Julie's breath caught. Evan, she said. Her voice a quiet whisper. He didn't speak at first. Just stood there with a stillness that felt deliberate. As if afraid one wrong move might shatter the moment. Then, softly, I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome. Julie blinked. Her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. You're here. I am, he said, stepping closer. I thought I should say thank you. But that's not why I came back. He met her eyes. His gaze unwavering. I've had everything. Money. Power. A name that opens doors. But I've never had peace. Not the kind where you can sit still and your breath feels like it belongs to you. Not until you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, lavender-flecked note she had left with his clothes. It was worn at the edges. Soft from being handled. I've read this more times than I should admit, he said, holding it out. Not because I was waiting to talk, but because it reminded me that there are still people in the world who give without expecting anything in return. I needed to remember that. Julie took the note, her fingers brushing his. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't expect anything, he said, his voice earnest. I know I left. And I know that says something about who I was. But I'm not running anymore. Not from a wedding. Not from my name. And not from you. He turned and walked a few steps down the hall, stopping in front of the door to room 6. His hand rested on the knob. Familiar and foreign all at once. He looked back at her. I don't know if you still have space in your heart for someone who disappeared without saying goodbye. But if you do, if there's still room, I'd like to stay. This time. On purpose. Julie's throat tightened. She stepped around the counter and walked slowly toward him. When she reached him, she looked not at the door, but at his face. I don't know what happens next, she whispered. But I do know this place. This forest. This quiet. It changed you. I see it. And I see you, he said. A ghost of a smile touching his lips, not the careful, practiced kind from the photos, but something smaller and real. Julie reached for the key in her pocket and unlocked the door. It creaked open slowly. A familiar, welcoming sound. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But she left the door open behind her as she stepped inside. And that, for now, was enough. 1 year later. The sign at the edge of the logging road no longer read just Motel. It now said the Pine Hollow Inn and Retreat. With a smaller, hand-carved sign underneath that read Forest and Fiber Papyri. The once faded paint was a deep forest green, and pots of lavender and heather lined the walkway. It was no longer a place of last resort, but a destination for those seeking quiet. Inside, the lobby smelled of fresh coffee, cedar, and drying paper. Evan, no longer the ghost of a man running from his past, stood behind the polished front desk, talking with a guest about the best hiking trails. He wore a simple flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up, and his smile was easy and genuine. Julie was in the old shed, now transformed into a bright, airy studio. Sunlight streamed through the new windows, illuminating sheets of her handmade paper drying on racks. She ran a hand over a fresh sheet, its surface embedded with tiny blue cornflowers. Evan came in, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Morning," he said, handing one to her. "Morning," she replied, her fingers lightly stained with ink, wrapping around the warm ceramic. He looked around the studio, a space they had built together, board by board. "Another order from that bookstore in Portland. We'll need to make more of the fern paper," she said, leaning against him for a moment. They stood in comfortable silence, a language they had perfected. That evening, they sat on the newly built porch of their small apartment, which they'd renovated above the office. The sun dipped below the pines, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The world was quiet, but it was a full quiet, brimming with life and peace. Evan took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her skin. "Do you ever miss the silence?" he asked. Julie looked at him. At the man who had mended stairs, planted gardens, and learned the art of being still. She looked at the life they had built from the ashes of their old ones. "This isn't silence," she said softly. "This is quiet. And it's home." He brought her hand to his lips. And in the fading light, they didn't need any more words. They had chosen this life, this peace, this love. And it had chosen them right back. Thank you for joining us for this gentle, healing story of quiet courage, unexpected connection, and the kind of love that doesn't need grand gestures, only presence. Julie and Evan's journey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful changes happen not in noise, but in stillness. That peace is not something we find, but something we build. And that love, at its truest, begins when we see one another clearly, without needing anything in return. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to become part of our storytelling family. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales that heal, inspire, and remind us of the quiet beauty in everyday kindness. Don't forget to turn on notifications. Leave us a comment with your thoughts. And share this video with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Until next time, stay soft, stay hopeful, and remember, sometimes, peace lives in the quiet, and it stays when we choose it.